I don't know why I sign up to the RSS of these guys in the first place because all the news that comes in leaves me in a state of just being completely disgusted. So, Inside Radio reports today iHeartMedia extends Pittman Bressler contracts through 2029. iHeartMedia's two top executives will remain in place for at least the next 4 years, and all I can think to myself is, wow, watching incompetence get rewarded is infuriating. It's absolutely awful. They've driven away people like me, and I can tell you that they're not going to get, data from people like me and our listening habits in the first place, because the fact of the matter is that the way, the manner that we get our music is not going to be easily trackable by them through their methods. I mean, YouTube knows what I listen to. If they can convince Google to sell them the data, perhaps they can get some awareness of what it is that, somebody like me actually listens to. But the way that they go about it is they track people's listening habits, and I spend 0 hours a year, 0 minutes, 0 seconds over an entire year listening to radio. In the car, if I forget to bring my cell phone, I sit in total silence and just listen to the engine of the car. I would pretty much rather watch paint dry than settle for the shit that is fed to us on the radio. And what is the problem? To a huge extent, it has to do with iHeartMedia's takeover of the radio. It's unlistenable. It's absolute pure low quality garbage that is simulcast, across the entire nation, and it sucks. It's uniquely awful. It's vile. Like you turn that shit on, and for it's insufferable after about 2.5 seconds, and so you turn it back off. What's the point? And Portland notoriously has absolutely awful radio. That just completely underserves the music market that exists within the boundaries of the Pacific Northwest. We're I'm not the only one that feels that the quality of the broadcast in this area is abysmal. I grew up in the 90s, and we had when the Telecommunications Act of 1996 came down, it took a long time for it to decay into the current state, but by now it's they've completely fucked up and ruined the local radio market. So in the 90s, I remember I spent about one summer, over that particular summer, at about the 96 era, with I Believe by Blessed Demon of Souls blaring over the radio. Having been a pretty big KKRZ, fan, which, they did the contemporary hit, stuff, so anything that had become really popular ended up getting on there. For a long time, only, the quality of popular music basically took a nosedive, at some point, and most of the hits ended up being pretty shitty after a while, and what it broadcasts now is pretty much goddamn unlistenable garbage, that you end up hearing every time you tune into, this particular station at this point. And, I grew up on it, and, I've watched music decay into something, almost unrecognizable from its former self. It's awful. I don't listen to this garbage anymore. If I'm in the car, I don't compromise. I either sit in total silence, or I use Android Auto Play to go over to Pandora. I will not listen to the fucking FM or AM or SSB or any of those broadcast spectrums, and the only reason why I ever even became interested in it was because of the number station people and hackers. There are radio broadcasts by the 2600 crowd that I don't mind listening to the recordings of after the fact, but this is that's about it. That's all that's left of my you know, radio listening habits. Other than that, it's basically dead. And the only reason why I'm interested in it is because these guys are like tech enthusiasts and they talk about that sort of stuff periodically on their broadcast, and that's it. You know, that I don't care, you know, otherwise about, you know, the broadcast you know, spectrum at all, and I'm watching, you know, incompetence get rewarded, you know, because things didn't have to be this way. They didn't have to suck this badly on the broadcast radio, but you have these two assholes in charge who, you know, during their tenure, you know, what was their response to all this internet radio breaking out and becoming super popular? FM radio, less variety. And this was despite the fact that all of us were clamoring for, you know, a much greater, you know, degree of variety, but, you know, they less variety. So let me I'm trying to pull up an old 2013 article from the Wall Street Journal, which, you know, which it took me a little bit of time to find, because unfortunately, you know, the you know, but yeah, radio's answer to Spotify: less variety. Stations create more repetition, throwing listeners would tune out unfamiliar tunes. But, you know, if I tune in and I hear the same shit over and over and over again, I'm tuning out. You know, they've basically killed any interest that I would have had in the radio at this point. Synth-punk band Capital Cities has plenty of songs on its debut album that it wants to promote as singles if only radio promoters would allow it. The band's hit, Safe and Sound, is the only song that most fans have heard. It's been playing on the radio for more than 2 years. And because so many listeners know the song, which peaked last year, the year's number 2 in the top 40 starts, stations are afraid to take it out of rotation. Safe and Sound just wasn't going away, said Capital Cities manager Dan Weissman, who postponed plans last fall all to promote the band's single until later this year. You don't want to shove it down people's throats if they're not ready to move on. Faced with growing competition from digital alternatives, which, by the way, started to win because they offered greater variety, traditional broadcasters have managed to expand their listeners with an unlikely tactic, offering less variety than ever. You know, oh god, that sent me fleeing for Pandora. The strategy is based on a growing research. Yeah, well, the research obviously didn't include me because this doesn't apply to me. Boom. You know, the strategy is based on a growing amount of research that has a biased sample, so it didn't include me, that shows increasingly granular detail what radio programmers have long believed. Listeners tend to stay tuned when they hear a familiar song and tune out when they hear music they don't recognize. Well, again, biased study. The data, coupled with ballooning number of music sources competing for listeners' attention, that are making radio stations more likely than ever to pull well-known hits from their rotation, extending time artists must wait to introduce new songs. The top 10 songs were played close to twice as much on the radio as they were heard 10 years ago, according to media base of Clear Channel Communications, Inc., that tracked radio spins for all broadcasters. The most broadcasted song last year, Robin Thicke's Blurred Lines, aired 749,633 times in the 180 markets monitored by Mediabase. That is 2,053 times on a day on average. The top song in 2003, When I'm Gone by Three Doors Down, was played 442,160 times that year. That is partly about the 70 new top 40 stations have sprouted up over the last decade, you know, said Clear Channel's president of national programming, Tom Pullman. Why stations specializing in rock and smooth jazz have dwindled, but other radio formats are getting more repetitive too. Where the line is blurring between pop songs and songs that would fit more neatly into other categories. As artists and listeners to embrace a wider variety of sounds as they jump from genre to genre on digital playlist. The top country song last year, which was 2013 as of the writing of this article. Darius Rucker's Wagon Wheel was played 229,633 times by the 2003's top country hit Lone Star, My Front Porch Looking In, got only 519 spins. This intensifying repetition is largely a response to the way radio stations now measure listenership. 6 years ago, the industry began tracking listeners in many markets with pager-like devices called portable Peter meters, which monitor all the stations, which wouldn't work on me because I don't listen to any of them, that selected listeners hear throughout the day in their homes, cars, or public spaces. Radio programmers can watch how many of these people tune in and out, and when they play a given song. In the past, the same listeners recounted their listening habits in handwritten diaries that were far less detailed or accurate. Programmers also take their other research into account when building the primetime playlist. Their listeners' surveys, social media buzz, since people meter data based on relatively small and tiny sample sizes, which gives you a completely biased sample, obviously isn't perfect. But the numbers are impossible for advertisers to ignore, and because listeners generally tune out when they hear a song they don't know, radio stations have carried a special time slots for new music so that they can keep familiar tunes in the regular lineup and preserve their ratings. 3 years ago, Clear Channel launched a program called Artist Integration that plays snippets of new songs during advertising time instead of music-designated time. Clear Channel itself is buying the ad slots in order to promote new records. In Los Angeles, Hip Hop State Power 160 does its experimenting with new tracks and New Tuesdays, which airs in the afternoon. Old-fashioned terrestrial radio remains by far the most popular source of music in the U.S., as of 2014 at least, in the way that most consumers say they discover new music, which I don't anymore. I can't rely on them. They don't do a good enough job exposing me to good stuff, so I had to go fully independent and cut them out. In addition to playing fewer hits more often, the radio industry has taken a range of other measures to hold on to its audience in the digital age. In August, for instance, broadcasters rolled out an app called Next Radio, preloaded onto many Sprint phones that let smartphone listeners listen to FM radio without draining their batteries or data plans. Songwriters and publishers of the top spun songs benefit from the extra airplay they get now, since they get paid royalties for every radio spin at a rate that increases once a song becomes a hit, thanks to the way that performing rights organizations distribute publishing royalties. But the record labels and artists who don't earn royalties from airplay in the U.S., the growing wait time to launch new singles makes it even harder to sell albums. Album sales fell by 8% in 2013. It's easier to sell albums when you have multiple hit singles. The veteran radio promoter Richard Palmes said he tells programmers they should spin a new song at least 150 times during peak listening hours, basically rush hour before they draw any conclusions about whether fans will like it or not, since many songs take time to grow on people. But that can be a hard sell. When Mr. Plenty first asked Top Radio 40 stations to play the Lumineers acoustic guitar-driven oh hey. In 2012, for example, many responded incredulously, making jokes along the lines of, "What are you giving me, Peter Paul? A Peter Paul and Mary record?" When Palmes gave up and set out to laud the record on adult alternative stations instead, 6 months later it peaked at number 2 on the top 40 chart. Sometimes there's simply no room for new tunes, despite a programmer's wishes. Elbro Dowden, a vice president of programming in New York's Hot 97, said he didn't have the space to immediately add a new single from Wiz Khalifa's album ONIFC when it came out last winter, even though he liked it. The record label had bought ad time, and Mr. Khalifa, who would come to do promotional interviews as one of hip-hop's biggest stars. In the new, intensely scrutinized world of radio, Mr. Durden said, taking risks is not rewarded, so we have to be more careful than ever. And so I am watching incompetence be rewarded. This refusal to take a risk at all has completely driven me from the radio. I have no interest in it anymore. I don't listen to it. The only radio progress that I will listen to is the, off the hook stuff by the 2600 crew. That's it. That is the full extent of my radio listening. iHeartRadio's two top executives will remain in place for the next 4 years, the company disclosed in an SEC filing, and Chairman, Chief Executive Officer Bob Pittman and Chief Operating Officer, Chief Financial Officer Rich Blitzler have signed contract amendments extending their employment agreements through December 31st, 2009. Their previous details were set to expire in 2026. The extensions not only lengthen their tenure but also adjust several key terms. All of this left me, referring to this. You remember? You know the line in the video where they ask, "Is this all you want to hear?" The only answer that I can come up with to that question is fuck no. The whole formula. I have one statement about the radio, and it's a foreign way of putting it, but essentially Q save and tudos. As in, they all must go. I would advocate not only firing the Chief Executive Officer, Bob Pittman, firing Richard Bressler, I would also advocate firing the entire board of directors, all of them. The whole fucking structure must be burnt down until everybody in leadership is gone. All the way from middle management, all the way down to the lowest level management to the top. All the managers need to be fired until they're all gone. And they need to be... totally new people need to be brought in at that company. They've ruined it. They have effectively lost, any hope of ever getting me back. I'm not coming back. I don't care. And radio in Portland is dog shit. And the radio was a lot better. In the 90s. And the listening experience, even on the top 40. Especially because by some point in the 90s, people who liked popular music, the top 40 crowd was not so terrible as it is now. The most popular songs back then were not, off so bad. People had taste, look at them now. What the fuck? Where the fuck did we go wrong? Is the question that I'm left, asking about all of this. But KKRZ is fucking unlistenable at this point, and it's become abysmal and everything, and everybody hates it, and it's well known and it's well discussed on Reddit how much the Portland radio sucks. Everybody knows it. It's a big open secret of the city. Nobody enjoys it and everything. And meanwhile, these assholes are fucking promoting themselves, despite their absolute colossal failure and being completely out of touch with people and drawing, conclusions about listeners based on insufficient sample sizes. The people you sampled tune out when they hear an unfamiliar song. Did you ever think that maybe your N size was so small you couldn't really draw valid conclusions from it? Because the lack of variety in radio is what cost me, my listenership.